Now we convene Synod Central. With their reactions to Cardinal Burke and Mueller is the Papal Posse. Editor-in-Chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Gentlemen, always a pleasure to be with you. I want to start with the bombshell of the week. The new dubia presented to Pope Francis by Cardinals Burke and Zen, Sarah, Brandmuller, and Inues. The reveal was timed for maximum effect earlier this week. Father Jerry, I'll begin with you. Your thoughts on what Cardinal Burke said earlier, that this is not an attack on the person of the Pope, that that's not what he's trying to do here.
No, Cardinal Burke is absolutely right. What's at issue here is the doctrine being taught by the Pope and by others, which contradicts previous teaching, particularly in regards to blessing of homosexual unions, giving communion to divorced and remarried, and then the very concerning question of whether the Church is going to reopen the study of ordination of women to the diaconate and the priesthood. There is a great pressure to do all of that. The Pope has given answers in these regards that are very troubling, and his response in the dubia really is troubling, particularly on the question of homosexual blessings, which he's encouraging pastors to do, as long as they're not confused with marriage. The communion for divorce and remarried, which started with Amoris Laetitia, that was also reaffirmed by the Pope in his response to a separate dubia question sent by Cardinal Duca from Prague. So we have here a lot of issues. They have nothing to do with personalities. You know, this is not about, I like this man, I don't like that man. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And as it's been pointed out by many observers, the real issue here is divine revelation true and is it binding? That's the real issue, because the reformers and the innovators, they're basically pushing divine revelation aside in favor of what Cardinal Burke called wokeism, giving into a secular agenda that's very popular in the Western world right now.
Yeah. Bob, your reaction, and what did you make of the other signatories to this these dubias? Cardinals Zen and Sarah in particular. Aren't the participants a message of their own here, in addition to the questions for clarity? I mean, these are men of real statures. Sarah, the former head of the liturgical office at the Vatican, divine worship, and Cardinal Zen, this heroic white martyr of freedom in China and a real clarion of truth and defiant truth under terrible circumstances.
Yeah, as we know, these are 5 men from 5 different continents. So basically, we have a representation of the entire world asking the Holy Father to clarify something that has remained in limbo in a variety of ways. And as we know, in the modern world, if you don't say no, the answer is yes. So we start to see the response to the dubia, which were inadequate, and actually they were reformulated. I think as Cardinal Burke said, they wanted a simple yes or no, which would set down some sort of marker. Instead, what we're getting is sort of very, very subtle attempts to say, well, you know, of course, blessing same-sex marriage is not the same as Christian marriage, but there are circumstances in which this is absolutely going to be lost on anybody but the people in the Theological Guild who already believe that that is true. And the same thing is true about the way they've talked about divorce and remarriage, that what they're and receiving communion. What they're saying is, well, if you really consult your conscience and you wrestle with it and you decide that you can come forward for communion, then it's between you and God. This again is a distinction that is going to disappear, because, as I like to joke sometimes, when people wrestle with their consciences, it's amazing how often they win against them. But look, these men are coming forward and saying this, what seems to be subtlety and a type of ambiguity is actually a defection from what the Church has taught throughout its entire 2,000-year history. And these are men, particularly Zen. Zen wrote a letter himself, as you know, Raymond, we'll probably get to.
Yeah, we're going to get into that in a moment.
Encouraging participants in the Synod to resist what's going on.
Yeah, let's get into that letter. This is a newly obtained letter, and we learned it was written in September. Cardinal Joseph Zen sent this to bishops and cardinals attending the Synod. and he implored them to petition the Vatican and Pope Francis to change the procedures of the synod. He warned against what he called reinvention of true synodality. He writes, "They, the synod organizers, begin by saying we must listen to all. Little by little, they make us understand that among the all are those whom we have, quote, excluded. Finally, we understand that they mean, what they mean are people who opt for a sexual morality different from that of Catholic tradition," end quote. Father Jerry, your thought on Zen's observations here. Cardinal Zen also wrote about the phenomenon of conversation in small groups, which he says shuts down true discussion and debate of the entire body.
Well, Cardinal Zen really is a heroic figure, and he's experienced how communists act, and I think he sees some analogies here in terms of how communists pretend to have consultation with the people, but it's all manipulated. It's sort of like the Politburo in the Soviet Union, or the Communist Party Central Committee. The word comes down, everybody has to say yes to it, and then everybody applauds at the end. This is not how a synod should be carried out. So to the point of organization, this synod is largely centering around group discussions, which are held at tables, and then there's an official rapporteur from the committee of the synod who will gather up what's said, write a report, submit it. There's not much opportunity for the general congregations where people could speak freely. And that really is what a synod is supposed to be about, speaking freely and trying to convince others of your point of view, not simply sitting around at a table and say, well, how does everybody react to this proposition? And there's a great fascination with people want to change morality with the idea, if people don't accept Catholic teaching, the problem is with Catholic teaching. And the Church's answer is always, there's no problem with God's revelation. The problem is with us, fallen human beings. And the call to conversion, as Cardinal Burke pointed out, that's how Christ began his preaching. We should always highlight the call to conversion, not the call to submission to the standards of the modern world.
Bob, Cardinal Zen also condemns the idea that there's some agenda at play. He calls that assertion a, quote, offense to our intelligence. Cardinal Zen does. What have you been hearing on the ground in Rome? And is Cardinal Zen's a common observation?
Well, I wouldn't say it was common. I think anyone who wants to really understand some of the underlying questions about the Synod ought to read his letter, because it's very incisive. He's dealt with people like this, as Father said before, and he wants to make sure that we understand what's going on. Look, the thing that I think is probably even more worrisome than these hot-button issues like gays and divorced and remarried and possibly deaconesses is that they're talking about a difference in the governance of the Church. Although they keep saying that this is just a chance for people to walk together, is that what's really going on? I mean, if this is really an exercise of a whole month of people kind of just conversing with one another, becoming familiar with one another's positions, coming to like one another, that's all well and good. But the Church isn't there just to facilitate that kind of social life. What it's there to do is to bring to bear on the world the revelation that God has given us, which is the only thing, as Cardinal Burke was saying, that can save us. All the rest of the things are secondary matters. And it would be great if, in addition to this maybe greater friendship that people are going to have from all parts of the Church, they also became more familiar as a result of interactions with what the real teaching of the Church is. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see that.
Yeah. Father Jerry, Bob jumped ahead of me a little bit. I was going to ask you, what do you think is the real intention of, this entire synod? But it seems like the organizers here, with papal approval, are hijacking language. They're demonizing anyone who raises questions, but they are attempting to refashion how the Church makes decision, how it is governed.
Well, that's the big problem. What does synodality mean as a style which is supposed to be experienced at all levels of church life? The fact that lay people are here given the equal vote as bishops, and as Cardinal Muller stated so well, this is it's taking away the nature of what a synod is and making it something else. But that seems to be an indication that now, according to the synodal church, bishops alone can't make decisions without getting the approval of a group of lay people, for instance, in their diocese. Now lay people are given roles in the Roman Curia that they never had before. And this is causing great confusion because people who are ordained bishops, that's a divine gift which comes from the Savior because they are, in fact, the shepherds of the sheep. And there's no disgrace in not being a shepherd. We're all sheep. We're all born as sheep of Christ at baptism. And then some are raised to positions of authority in order to benefit the church through the administration of the sacraments and guidance and teaching. But this idea that it's inauthentic unless everybody has a say and a decision-making power, that's not how the Catholic Church is organized. And I'm afraid that's what's behind at least some of the ideological points that are coming out of the Instrumentum Laboris, the working document. And then this whole mystifying practice where, we're going to find out what it is as we go along. That reminds of Nancy Pelosi. We'll know what the bill says after we pass it. No, that's not how we operate in the Catholic Church. You want to read the Scriptures? You read the Scriptures. You learn what it says. You want a synod to have a meaning? Tell me what you're about. Don't tell me I'll find out as I sit there. And now, of course, the information is controlled very tightly, so I may not find out everything I do need to know.
Yeah, and I want to get into that in a moment. Bob, Cardinal Mueller touched on this as well when he spoke about the synod being a manipulation and his criticisms of the treatment of Orthodox bishops. Do you see a full-scale effort here to remake the structures, the processes of the church? And what do you think the end result is if successful?
Well, I think there's an effort here to democratize, even though there's a denial that that's actually what's going on. I mean, why else would you, as Father says, change this structure that has existed in the Church? When we say apostolic, we mean it comes not only from Jesus, but from the apostles, who he appointed to be his teachers and his evangelists in the world. So this goes right back to the very beginning. What the actual result of this is going to be, I don't think we'll know for a while, because it's such an obvious revolution in the way that the Church conducts its own business. I don't know how much of what people say in the Synod is actually going to make a difference at the end of the day. But clearly, the people who are running the Synod are going to be able to claim, because we're not going to have votes, as in previous Synods, about who approved or who disapproved of points. Well, we're going to have our reports on what was discussed. And I think we know pretty well what the rapporteurs who have been appointed as part of the synodal structure, how they're going to be inclined to report on what actually happened in these discussions. So I think in the short run, there's going to be an inclination to overemphasize things like LGBT and the other things that we've talked about, which of course will be blown up in the secular press as if it's what everything that's going on. And I think all of us ought to be very cautious about actually reporting on this, because there's such a restriction of what's going to be coming out officially that we want to be careful not to jump ahead and assume that certain things have happened or believe certain things that people are saying. We're going to have to be very cautious. But the long-term goal, it seems to me, is precisely this type of democratization in the Church, which I don't know how it can possibly be integrated with the kind of hierarchical structure of priests, bishops, archbishops, and cardinals, and then the Pope. But I think that's what they're hoping that in the course of synodality we're going to find out.
Well, Bob, we don't know the outcome of this synod, but I will tell you, these dubia responses from the Holy Father and Cardinal Fernandez, his doctrinal officer, these are disturbing, and I want to dive into this for a moment. Czech Cardinal Dominik Duka sent a formal question, a dubia, to the Pope, asking about Catholic divorcees without annulments and whether they should be given communion. And now blessings of gay unions predicated, all of it is being predicated on that footnote in Amoris Laetitia. People have tried to smear and dismiss us as papal critics. I want to be clear. I'm a reporter. Okay, we are calling things as we see them for what they are. This isn't criticism or animus or ideology. It's facts. You don't like the facts? Take it up with the people creating them. Here's the papal posse from April 2016 on that infamous footnote, and then I'll get your reaction. Watch.
It does say it. The Church should accompany some people in irregular unions with the sacraments. But the point being, the Pope would like people to have the opportunity in particular cases, after talking to a priest, after reviewing the guidelines of the local bishop, to be able to receive communion. This is a direct contradiction of Pope John Paul II in Familiaris Consortio and subsequent documents. It contradicts the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Robert Royal, last year, you will remember, I think it was the end of the year show or the New Year's show, and I boldly and perhaps brazenly predicted that Pope Francis was going to change the practice, if not the doctrine of the Church, vis-a-vis communion for divorced and remarried people, and that it would have the effect of changing the doctrine. Has that happened? Father Jerry and then Bob, after 7 years, were we correct? Are we witnessing the beginning of a change in practice that will de facto change the doctrine, no matter how many times you say it hasn't changed?
Absolutely. Cardinal Fernandez's response to the dubia, which Pope Francis endorsed by signing it, states flat out that if someone in conscience decides that they're in an he doesn't use this language of adultery. By the way, notice how they never call it adultery. They call it a regular situation. But I'll call it what the Bible uses, the word adultery. You know, if a man who divorces a wife and marries another commits adultery. And he says people in that situation, if they're in conscience, are comfortable with it, and they're not able to change, then they can go to the sacrament of Holy Eucharist. This is an abomination. This is wrong. It is a direct contradiction of the teaching of our divine Savior. The Catholic Church has never endorsed this. It is wrong. We've gone from a footnote now to a direct answer that the Pope has endorsed by his doctrinal chief, and this is a big problem. The reality is you can't change the Lord's teaching. You can ignore it or deprecate it or put it aside. But, you know, this is the original dubia. We're saying, what happens to the marriage that got a divorce? Don't we teach that marriage is lifelong? We do. So this is wrong, and this is a problem. Sacrament. This will have to be remedied by the next Pope because it can't stand.
At the time when we discussed that in 2016, you were a little hesitant to say that the doctrine might, be leading to, or that the practice might be leading to a doctrinal change. What are your thoughts now, particularly sitting in Rome as the Synod begins?
Well, Raymond, I wish you hadn't brought up ancient histories in this show. But look, we can predict with almost absolute certainty, right, that if it gets abroad, and it's going to be disseminated not only by the mainstream media, but even by some organs in the Church itself, but if it gets abroad that a bishop in a diocese or the priests underneath him in that diocese can do blessings of civil unions, because it has not been opposed by the Pope. He's raised the possibility that it could be okay. By the same token, if the possibility for a person who's divorced and remarried without an annulment, if that is raised, that in your conscience you decide you can come forth by communion and you can receive, if that is disseminated, and it will be, then we can predict with near certainty that almost no one will be able to resist. There'll be some heroic bishops who won't allow it in their dioceses. There'll be some heroic priests who also will not offer, say, communion or a blessing. But the general direction is going to be that the local pressure that will be put on bishops and priests by activists, by the media, saying, you're not even following your own Pope's directives. He's allowed this possibility. You're not merciful. You're rigid. You're terrible. I mean, how many people, how many bishops, how many priests are going to be able to resist that? I'm sorry to say that in the long run, I think it's going to be a very small percentage, and they're going to find themselves in trouble. So, unlike my youthful self, I think that I'm now convinced that the practice will lead to a de facto change in doctrine. Unless it's stopped, of course.
Wow. You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Father Jerry, is it now permissible? I'm reading these headlines. The Pope softens Church's position on blessing same-sex unions. That was a headline all over the country just the other day. And I'm getting incoming. I wish I could read you my email. That could take like 2 hours. And these are people you would know, people you've never heard of. What does this mean? What are they saying? Does it mean that we're going to see not only adulterers, let's say it, that's what the Church calls them, adulterers coming forward and receiving communion without any repentance or an annulment, and gay couples coming forward and getting a blessing in the Catholic Church? Is that now permitted?
The response in the dubia by Pope Francis says that pastors should explore forms of blessing that for union of people who are in that situation, that do not give the impression that it is a marital blessing, that it's a blessing of a marriage. He says it straight out. It's probably one of the most shocking things I've read of any pontiff, and certainly he is giving the go-ahead to pastors to do these things. This is really outrageous. This is contradicting directly what the Church has always taught and done. This contradicts what the Pope himself authorized for publication back in 2021. You might remember that famous document from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, in which the sentence was simple: we cannot bless sin. Well, now the Pope is saying, find ways to do this that don't give the impression that you're blessing a marriage. The second set of dubia questions that Cardinal Burke and the others submitted rephrased and said, Holy Father, the issue here is not simply that people are going to think this is a marriage. They're going to think that homosexual activity is now good, is something that can be blessed, because remember what a blessing is. It's asking God to favor with his grace certain forms of behavior. And this behavior, the biblical word is sodomy. This is a misuse of the sexual faculty with the person of the same sex. It's wrong. It's never permissive. It's intrinsically wrong. That teaching is unchangeable. So I regret this falls in line. And remember, the Pope said earlier in a film interview, he said that he was in favor of civil unions for homosexuals. And I was saying, no, wait a minute. You're encouraging people to enter into a state of life based on a mortal sin? So the same criticism applies here. I hope there's a great pressure put on the Pope from all the bishops throughout the world to say, Holy Father, we cannot do this. We cannot say that homosexual activity is good and should be blessed.
Well, at the top of the synod, we have to say this. I mean, again, we have to report what's happening. And what has happened is the Vatican has essentially taken the German synodal way and they just exported it to the entire world. So people were rending their garments over the German synodal way. I await the reaction to what we've just heard in these dubia responses. Gentlemen, before we run out of time, I want your thoughts on the idea of criticism. Asking questions within the family of faith, even where it concerns the Vatican. The cardinals who have been asking these formal questions, these dubia, have been roundly attacked for simply seeking clarification. We on this program, the Papal Posse, you all, have been roundly condemned of late by certain media outlets for simply asking questions.
Well, I think that any question that is raised to help advance the truth of Catholic revelation that's been given us by God, it is not our creation. Any question that is raised in sincerity and with respect and whatnot, I think that is part of what life in the Church. If we want to talk about synodality, and the Pope tried to kind of, I think, do a little jujitsu with the five cardinals and saying that this is what we want in synodality. So they've spoken out boldly. But there's a way in which at least some of the people around the Pope, and sometimes, I'm sorry to say he himself, have kind of personalized this as if to raise a question that you feel you're trying to promote the fidelity to Christ himself, who came to earth and suffered and died on the cross for us, that you're raising that question that somehow you're attacking the head of the Church in the world. I just don't see how these things mesh together. It's a personalizing that's not really true, and I think Cardinal Burke has said that. But this being said, it's well known in theological circles that you make advances by asking questions. That if you read St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, it's a series of questions. You ask a question, you answer it, you then ask another question, and that's the way you move forward. And that's true. That's true synodality. It is not disrespectful. Yeah. It is not a personal attack on the Pope.
Well, and questions are not dangerous. Answers are sometimes dangerous, as we're learning. The first reactions to the synod, gentlemen, I have to say, to my eye in the United States, they don't seem all that great. No one here really knows what's happening, or even what a synod is, which is the question I've gotten all week. The attendance at the papal mass over the weekend, really to start this whole global affair, was pretty sad. The attendance was scant, as you see in those images. I have to say I've been struck by the number of Catholics who I have heard who've come to me, stopped me on the streets of New York in distress, asking, what should we do here? Should we become Orthodox? They are literally being repelled by the news they're hearing, that they're seeing in dribs and drabs. My message to them is very simple. If your mother were being attacked in your home, would you abandon her and look for another home? No, you stay and you fight for your mother. Well, Mother Church is now enduring similar violence. This is no time to flee. This is a time to stand firm, I think. Father, I'll let you have the last word. Your reaction to what you're seeing in this first session, the early days there in Rome, and what would you say to those Catholics?
No, I would say to the Catholics, we do not abandon ship because there are storms tossing about Holy Mother Church.
Father, I think you're right. And you know, St. Paul, Catherine of Siena, they do furnish us with an example of challenging the Pope, correcting the Pope even, in love and in the family. And maybe that's what people are called to do at this moment. We shall see. Gentlemen, we'll leave it there. For commentary by Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray and their regular Synod podcasts from Rome, visit thecatholicthing.org. And of course, follow EWTN, go to the YouTube page for the world over updates. This will be indispensable in these days.